going first. We want to give her a round of applause first to give her encouragement. All right.
So around July in Hong Kong, when the first protest started happening, my uncle found himself in a predicament. Everywhere he turned was a different protest. He was just trying to get back home from work one afternoon and tried to go around the protest happening in central Hong Kong, but the waterfront where he could usually escape from was blockaded by police. The only way he could get back home was directly through Main Street. Now, this was early on in the protest before they began to get too violent, but the protesters had already started hucking water bottles and trash at the police, and the police were already shooting tear gas at the protesters. When people started to run away, he managed to get out of the way until he could safely get home. And that's a picture of his two daughters, my cousins, and then that's a picture he took in Hong Kong's MTR, or Metro, of like some school kids getting stopped before school by police. So you might be thinking, this isn't a big deal, it's just like a normal day in the city. But the scariest part to me was how nonchalant he was when he told me about it. If I'd been in that situation, I would constantly be telling the story of how I escaped insanity. But these kinds of stories are so common in Hong Kong, even my 7-year-old cousin has them. This is the problem. Hong Kong has gone so far from normalcy in their streets that seeing projectiles and tear gas on Main Street is a normal thing now. To understand the problem in Hong Kong, you must first understand its history. For thousands of years, Hong Kong was a part of China, just a city in China. But then in the 1840s, China and Britain got into a war that turned Hong Kong into a British colony. But in 1997, China wanted Hong Kong back because its economy was flourishing. So Britain agreed on a transfer of power that started Hong Kong's special status, meaning that Hong Kong has a separate currency, government, and laws from China. And that's a picture of the handover of power. And that little box there is Hong Kong, and the rest is China. In February, the PRC, or People's Republic of China, announced a new extradition bill that would extradite or send people arrested in Hong Kong to mainland China for further investigation and trials. This announcement was met with tons of controversy, and people started marching to oppose the bill. Opposers knew that this bill would target activists and journalists who spoke out against China and would send them to mainland China and a system that's already pinned against them. In response to these protests, Carrie Lam, Hong Kong's chief executive, announced on September 4th that that the bill would be withdrawn, but the protesters said that it was too little, too late. These initial protests ignited a force in Hong Kongers that we've seen take off in the past couple months. The protesters announced another 4 demands, additionally to the withdrawal of the bill that's already been met. These demands are pardons for arrested protesters, an investigation into police brutality, for the protests to stop being called riots, and universal suffrage. While China's been under communist rule for more than 70 years, with Xi Jinping currently as president, Hong Kong has a 1,200-person committee that votes for their chief executive, and most of these committee members are Beijing loyalists who vote to please the PRC, meaning that whoever wins is most likely the candidate that Beijing prefers, and this is a big reason why a lot of Hong Kongers support universal suffrage. In 2007, Beijing announced that universal suffrage would be granted by universal suffrage is one person, one vote, so like the democracy we have, but without the representative. You get what I mean. In 2007, Beijing announced that universal suffrage would be granted by 2017, but in 2014, they said that if universal suffrage were ever to happen, the candidates would have to be picked by a committee that would be picked by China, which would disregard the whole purpose of universal suffrage. But in November, Hong Kong had a turn for the better, I would say, with their district council elections, where they experienced a record turnout and pro-democracy candidates won big. 17 out of the 18 seats went to candidates that supported pull for a democratic government, which is 3 times more than the current total, or the previous total in 2015, or almost about 3 times more. But the thing is that the district councils have little to no power in Hong Kong government, but they are notable to invalidate Carrie Lam's claim that the silent majority disagrees with the fight for democracy. In fact, enough people agree with the fight for democracy that about 20% of Hong Kong's entire population have hit the streets at some time to speak their minds on this issue in a place where many feel there is no other way to do so. People who just want a place like the U.S. for Hong Kong have been facing unjust arrest, including the astounding number of minors being arrested. I believe as of October that there were 750 minors who've been arrested, and then as of November, I think 28th, don't quote me on that, that 4,500 people total were arrested. They're also facing isolation and brutality, and non-protesters have been facing schedule delays, dangerous tear gas inhalation, and some are even moving away to like Taiwan and other places around them to avoid the protests altogether. My family in Hong Kong advised me that the best way for us to combat this issue is to raise awareness and keep shining spotlights on these issues and stories. When China is faced with international pressure, including the newly enacted Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, they will be influenced enough to listen to the protesters crying out for cooperation. After interviewing my uncle and cousins about the issue, I decided that the best way for us, those of us abroad, to deal with this issue is to contact our local news establishments. I was going to write into the Philadelphia Inquirer, but they had a minimum of 100 words, or maximum, the maximum of 100 words, and I had too much to say, so I settled on the Intelligencer, which had a 250-word maximum. They haven't gotten back to me yet, but they should soon, and I'm hoping that by getting the word out there, more people will become aware of the issue and how to help it. Thank you. Any questions?